Dave had a hard time falling asleep at night. He spent most of his time studying the imperfections in the paint on his ceiling. Dave hated riding the bus because of the lack of contact with individuals around him. He always felt out of place. Dave's friends were usually unpredictable, even though in a way that quality technically made them predictable. Dave pondered this conundrum while his teacher started class. Dave found himself in one class after the other, looking at the people and fantasizing about all the things he wanted to write. In lunch, one of Dave's friends talked about the newest game releases and why they were tasteless garbage. Speaking of tasteless garbage, how's about this cafeteria food? Dave said in a desperate attempt for a laugh. The only thing that followed was silence. Dave returned home to watch his ceiling and think about why he wasn't writing. After a long while, he decided to call someone. He ended up on the phone with one of his best friends, who was in the middle of playing video games. Dave asked about why he never wrote anymore. "I don't know, man. It's one of those things that if you really care about, you just have to sit down and do it," he said, followed by cussing repeatedly at someone in the game. Dave lay in bed for another hour before his mother told him he needed to get out more. Dave sat on the side of the street and watched the cars go by. Dave got home, watched a YouTube video, and then wrote about a man trapped in a room with no doors and one window. He deleted everything he wrote shortly after. The next morning, Dave started to lose focus during a free period in class. Dave didn't get changed for gym. He sat on the sidelines as he watched 24 of his classmates line up to choose teams for kickball. He thought about the character he trapped in a room. He wondered if that character's short-lived existence on a screen would in any way be the end of him completely, or if he ever existed at all. Perhaps it was just a random assortment of letters that, when viewed in proper order, brought about a figment of imagination for a brief moment in an ever-changing state of conscious being. Dave had been thinking about the end a lot lately. His English teacher talked about everyone's philosophy of life and how some people follow different schools of thought. He talked about existentialism and the idea that the only real moment in any person's life is their death. Dave thought about how cruel that is, that the only moment in his life worth sharing would be buried with him, forever entombed in a casket, or perhaps it would be spread across the vast expanse with his cremated remains. Dave tried to write something during lunch, but he was too distracted by the conversation around him to do so.
And then Brett runs in and was like, "You know, you're okay." And I was like, "No." And I slid out of the chair and I was really embarrassed. And a bunch of people texted me that said it was auntie. And apparently it was all over the cafeteria.
I think there's a real way to connect with him.
I find myself watching people sleep more often
Hi,
than this
I'm Paul.
He then realized that he had forgotten to eat that day. When Dave got home, a friend called and asked if he wanted to go on a hike. He said no thanks, and then went on a hike by himself. That night, Dave wrote about his ex-girlfriend. As he lay in bed, Dave's mind drifted back to his friends, how in a matter of years they could go from being the people closest to him to those most distant. He thought about who would spread his ashes when he died. He decided it would depend on when he died. Dave walked with his friend who always played video games to lunch. His friend asked why Dave would be concerned with who would spread his ashes if he'd be dead anyway. Dave didn't write that night. When he awoke the next morning, everything was very loud. Dave found he couldn't focus and had no motivation to get up and move. That evening, Dave saw his therapist. She was a young woman who was often very straightforward. Dave found this to be helpful at most every turn in his life. However, this time he couldn't seem to focus on anything she was saying. Dave's mother picked him up from therapy and brought him home. Dave could hear the buzzing change with the frequency of the imperfections in his ceiling, which began to look like static. Dave's friend asked him why he'd been so quiet lately, but Dave didn't hear him. Dave's teachers weren't speaking sensibly anymore, and all their handouts looked blank. Dave wasn't feeling good, so he went home early. He sat in front of his window and stared at the flowers until his mom came home from work.